Joining me now, legendary whistleblower, president of the board of directors of the Freedom of the Press Foundation, and American hero, Edward Snowden. Edward, good to have you on the Young Turks.
Thank you, Cenk. It's good to be here.
No problem. First question is, hey, where are you?
I'm in my apartment in Moscow. It's about 3:20 in the morning here, and I haven't slept yet.
Okay, well, thanks for coming on. I appreciate it. Seriously, boy, what a day to have you on, because right now we're in the middle of a controversy where a whistleblower has gone through the exact right procedures and reported that there is a matter of urgent concern where the American president made a promise to a foreign country, and the administration will not allow them to explain what they did wrong. So as a whistleblower and someone who was harangued for not going through the right procedure, what is your take on that?
Well, I think what we need to remember here is this is actually extraordinarily standard. This is what every White House does. Whenever they are accused of some wrongdoing, whenever there is some allegation of criminal or unconstitutional behavior, of violations of human rights, or even basic waste, fraud, and abuse, anything that implicates the structure of power itself, particularly prominent officials, what they try to do is they try to recontextualize the conversation. They try to make the controversy about the source of the allegation, that is the whistleblower, rather than the allegation itself. And I think what we need to remember, not just as a public, but as a broader global society, because this is an issue that's not just in the United States, it's everywhere, is the provenance of the allegation is never what matters. It's the proof that is offered for it to assess whether or not it's actually true, right? Our feelings about the controversy have to matter less than the facts of it. And whenever we see this kind of shoot the messenger tactic occurring, we need to think, what can we do to stop this? We've got to test the facts, not the people behind them.
So do you feel some vindication that what you did was the right way to release the information that you had, given that what everybody told you about, oh, if you just followed procedure, it would have gotten out anyway, doesn't seem to have worked in this particular case in the Trump administration?
Well, I mean, this hasn't happened. It hasn't worked since the 1970s with Daniel Ellsberg. We saw this in the case of Thomas Drake in the early 2000s, Thomas Tam at the Department of Justice, talking about the Bush-era warrantless wiretapping program. In every case, the whistleblower faces prosecution or investigation. Thomas Drake, who was a senior NSA executive, lost his house, lost his career, eventually lost his wife. Now he works in an Apple store. And this is what his reward was for telling the public that the United States government was violating the rights of everyone in the country. The fact that we are still having the same conversation, 10 years later, 40 years later, is an indication that this, again, it's not about a particular administration. It's about a broken system of power, and through that, really, the instrumentalization of a system of not justice, but injustice. Any democracy, sorry, I get a little amped up when I talk about this, but we have this single bottom line basis for every government after every election in every country, which is a democratic government derives its legitimacy from the consent of the governed, at least theoretically. But that consent is only meaningful if it's informed. And we have had government after government lying to us. And this has never been more clear, I think, than now, because at least in prior governments, they have at least had the decency to be artful in their lies.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you about whether it got worse, because Daniel Ellsberg didn't have to go into hiding. He didn't have to go to prison and for releasing the Pentagon Papers. But now, as you pointed out, Thomas Drake is working in an Apple store. You're in hiding in Moscow, and it happened under both Democratic administrations and Republican administrations. People like to say that Donald Trump is particularly lawless, and there's a good record for that. But on the other hand, it's not like the Obama administration was any more understanding of people trying to expose the things that the powerful were doing wrong.
Well, and at least to this point, it's actually, it was worse under the Obama administration, not by my counting, but by the government's own. The Obama administration brought more charges against sources of journalism under the Espionage Act, which affords no defense. It sort of denies those accused of access to a fair trial than all other presidents combined. And actually, we have some of those cases now under the current White House. We have Daniel Hale, who is a whistleblower who provided documents about the U.S. drone program, extrajudicial killings, right? This is where people are actually being killed often far from any battlefield, in some cases actually American citizens, such as the case of Anwar al-Awlaki and his son, who was, I think, actually 15, 16 years old when he was killed. We have, of course, Reality Winner, who's in prison now. She got 63 months for a single document, which, by the way, was about the NSA's assessment that the Russians were targeting electoral interference or electoral infrastructure. I mean, you would think the media really would have defended her, but in fact, the corporate media, at least, they disappeared. They just evaporated when this story hit the headlines. We have Terry Albury, who revealed documents about the FBI sort of manipulation and exploitation of minority communities for human sourcing. And it goes back and back and back. You mentioned Daniel Ellsberg. Daniel Ellsberg is actually one of the people who said if he was a whistleblower coming forward today, he would not stay in the United States because our laws have changed, our system has changed. But even in the idea that Daniel Ellsberg sort of walked, he didn't have to go into hiding, is actually historically inaccurate. He's a friend of mine now. We've met in person, and we both serve on the board at the Freedom of the Press Foundation. And he told me not only did he go into hiding for a very long time during the period of reporting, eventually he did face the same exact charges that I was facing, but they let him out on bail, and he got to talk to the media, stuff that you can't even imagine nowadays for a whistleblower. And the only reason he walked, he said he thought he was going to spend the rest of his life in prison, is because the Nixon administration was so particularly lawless, something that, again, never really changes, that they went so far, so egregiously, that the court itself had to flush the case because the Nixon administration had been offering, for example, the judge that was over the case, if the judge could basically convict Ellsberg and wipe this off the plate very quickly, the judge might be qualified to be the next director of the FBI, which had been a lifelong dream of this person. The Nixon administration knew it. They broke into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office looking for evidence to discredit him. And Ellsberg also told me that when he was out, there were CIA documents that were later made available to him through FOIA requests and things like that, that said the administration had brought up people who had been involved in the Bay of Pigs invasion. And they had been brought to a protest that Ellsberg was going to be at with orders to, quote from the documents, incapacitate him totally, which he told me at the time was a common euphemism, obviously, for just killing someone. So governments have never been friendly in the context of whistleblowers. And it's sad, honestly. It's simply sad that all these years later, when we have so many examples of the necessity of journalists having access to sources of real material facts inside the government, these sources then being not prosecuted, but in fact persecuted for it. Because what this means is we're building a system that steadily over time produces more of these cases where the incentives are clear. Whistleblowers will not be available when we need them the most, because to blow the whistle is to light a match and sort of burn your life to the ground. You have to believe that the public needs to know the things that you're revealing more than you need to be free.
So that brings us to your book, Permanent Record. It's your autobiography. And let me, well, you said burn your life to the ground. Do you think that's basically what's happened to you? Has your life been burnt to the ground because of the way the American government has treated you?
Yeah, and I mean, this is again, like I said, there's a long history for this. The thing that I feel quite fortunate about is I knew what was coming. If you watch Citizen 4, the documentary from 2013 when I came forward, they asked me on camera, what's going to happen before any of this happened, and I said, oh, they're going to say, I'm a traitor. They're going to say I endangered lives. They're going to say I harmed national security. They're going to charge me under the Espionage Act, and it's not because this is I'm particularly insightful. It's because they always do this. So I knew the consequences I was likely to face, and I thought I was actually going to spend the rest of my life in prison, as Ellsberg did, because that's the likeliest outcome. But I'm still here, and I'm still speaking, and sort of the old bad tools of political repression, things like exile, are beginning to fail because of technology. And one of the interesting things behind this book and my story is showing that it's much more difficult today to silence inconvenient voices, no matter what you do. The government, in fact, sued both myself and the publisher of this book, Permanent Record, on day one of its availability. But that's only made more people want to read it.
Do you miss America?
Of course. I mean, wouldn't you?
I would.
It'll always be my intention to come back. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, look, obviously it's taken an unreal toll on your life. You don't live in your homeland next to your family and friends and all the people that you've ever known, and you're in exile. And given that, look, it worked in the sense that you got us absolutely critical information, but it didn't work in the sense that the government didn't change. And so, did you have any regrets given that it didn't work?
No, and this is a common question, and I think it's an important one, but this is where it's so central to understand what the act of whistleblowing is about. I didn't come forward to change the laws. I didn't come forward to burn down the NSA. And I wanted to do that. I could have done it in an afternoon because of my technical accesses. I had a lot of influence on the network. I came forward to provide people the facts that I believe they needed to know in order to understand what's going on in the world, what their government is doing, both in their name and against them. And from this, we can have a more informed kind of society. And a lot of this sounds very abstract, and people are like, "Yeah, that's great. Nobody really cares," but that's not actually true. And this is one of the things that actually is quite topical to the controversies that we're having today. Prior to 2013, there was evidence that the government could be engaging in a program of mass surveillance. During the Bush era, in the December of 2005, of course, the warrantless wiretapping program was revealed in the New York Times. The sad reality is the New York Times had this story and they were ready to publish it right before Bush's re-election in October of that election year. But they sat on it at the request of the White House, and they only ran it when the journalists who had uncovered the story had finished books, and then the newspaper is about to be scooped by their own journalists. And so out of fear of looking, like what they were, they ran the story, and it was, a big scandal. But the Bush White House said, okay, we shouldn't have been doing this, just slap on the wrist. And they said, we shut this program down and we're going to pass a new law to do new structures. What actually happened was they shut half of the program down. And the other half, the half they shut down, they renamed the terrorist surveillance program. Because publicly that would sound very nice, and it would be hard for anyone to criticize it. The other half, they continued secretly renaming it the president's surveillance program. That morphed and continued and expanded and became a larger system of mass surveillance, which we were dealing with today. And that's essentially what the disclosures of 2013 were about. But as I said, there were still indications. There were court cases. In fact, one, Amnesty versus Clapper, got flushed just 3 or 4 months before I came forward. And this is all part of a continuum, right? So there was an expert class, there were researchers, there were technologists who knew this kind of thing could be happening, and maybe in some ways it was happening, but no one could prove it. And so everyone who was discussing it had to deal with it as speculation, right? It was a kind of conspiracy theory. What 2013 did, more than changing the laws, which it did, more than any programs, which it did, more than changing the basic underlying security infrastructure of the internet, which it did. We live in both a safer and freer society as a result of these disclosures. It transformed speculation into fact. Everyone could start making decisions, could start casting votes, could start re-engineering systems, could start proposing legislation on the basis of a common understanding. And this is what we've been missing over these last couple of years, because the entire political winds, the entire way we engage with each other has changed such that your feelings about an issue have become more central and more important in the debate than the actual facts. And this is lethal to a democracy, because if we cannot agree on what is happening, how can we have a conversation on what we should do about it? And so these new people coming forward, if they have facts and they can prove these allegations, and we can transform these things from speculation of wrongdoing to evidence of wrongdoing, that's absolutely vital. And the fact that we see power once again trying to prevent the public gaining access to essential facts that are really the only thing that allow we the people to hold the leash of government rather than being the ones that are being leashed, right? We're supposed to be partner to government rather than subject to it. What we are being robbed of is not just our civic power. It is our ability, our agency to determine our own futures. We are being subordinated to a system rather than directing that system. And the way that changes is not people and agencies deciding, you know, I'm the president of secrets for the day, saying this is the way the law should be, this is what I believe. It's engaging as part of a larger system. Now, there's all these arguments about proper channels and things like that. We've seen historically they don't work. We're seeing right now the kind of opposition they face. But I think we also have journalists now understanding more centrally, if they don't contest the government's monopoly on information, no one else will. This is why we have freedom of the press. This is why the Fourth Estate is so central in free and open societies. And I think this is actually something that, despite all the challenges it's facing, despite all the attacks that are being leveled at it, we still in the United States believe in. Not everyone, not universally, but enough of it, enough of us, that so long as these values survive, I think we will survive as a country. And when we lose our commitment to those values, which is one of the reasons that I wrote this book, is I feel that there is a mood changing where these values are increasingly coming under threat, not just in the United States, but many advanced democracies. But we need to have this conversation. We need to stand and defend not just the things that we say and feel right now, but the rights and freedoms that we inherited, because it can happen here and we can lose them very quickly.
So, look, I don't want people to get what I'm saying wrong. I think that what you did was incredibly helpful to our open society and democracy. The information alone makes a giant difference. And that's why New York Times not only held the story that you're talking about before the 2004 election, they also held the story about how the Bush administration had bin Laden cornered in Tora Bora and let him go. It was an amazing, groundbreaking story, and they did not share that incredibly valuable information with the electorate. They made a deeply political decision to protect the Bush administration and print it after the election. So it happens over and over again. So right now, they're fighting back against the Trump administration because he's not part of the normal establishment. And so I'm heartened to see that, I'm happy to see it. But unfortunately, I'm not sure that it's gonna last if another establishment politician gets back into office. So I did wanna ask you as a follow-up though, obviously you told us what the NSA was doing for a fact back then. What's your sense right now as to how much those surveillance programs are continuing?
Oh, they're all continuing. That's what people don't really understand and appreciate in large part. So in June of 2013, when I came forward, you've got Barack Obama in front of the White House podium, looking very dissatisfied because he's in the hot seat. And he says, no, I don't think Mr. Snowden's a patriot. There's other things he could have done, and all these typical sort of things. There's no way to have perfect security and perfect privacy. So he's basically saying, don't worry so much about the Fourth Amendment. Just trust us. These powers are great. They're keeping people safe. As the stories and reporting continued on, as he appointed, to his credit, 2 different independent commissions to study whether these programs were effective or not, turned out they weren't saving lives. Despite more than 10 years of operation, the very first program that was studied, Section 215 of the Patriot Act, this is the legal authority that was underpinning the mass collection, right? Indiscriminate, untargeted. Doesn't matter whether it's your grandmother, the most innocent person in the world, or an actual terrorist. Everybody's communications are being collected all the time. Your phone records, right, are being delivered by Verizon to the NSA every single day. And the only court order that ever heard, or the only court that ever heard anything about this, was the secret FISA court, which over 33 years was asked 33,900 times by the government to approve surveillance. And in 33 years and 33,900 times, the court only told the government no 11 times. So they are very much a rubber stamp. And this is the only kind of authorization that happened. Now, after it came out that these programs weren't saving lives, and in the government's own words, had never made a concrete difference in a single counterterrorism investigation, January of 2014, Obama says, while he could never condone what I did, this conversation made us stronger as a nation. He proposes that we end this particular program. We passed the USA Freedom Act, which forbids the NSA from engaging in this program in this way. But then they just say, well, we're going to do the same exact kind of thing. We're just going to have the phone companies hold the records, and then the NSA get a warrant and give it to the phone companies, which is still a big improvement. But they're still going to have a mass database, perfect records of all of our private lives. And this kind of permanent history on everyone that's being created for everything we do, everywhere you go, all of your cell phone movements are being tracked. Even if you have location services off on your phone, just by virtue of the way the technologies work, your phone is constantly screaming in the air, here I am, and every cell phone tower you pass is making a note and saying, saw this phone at this time. They've got the billing information, so they know it belongs to this person. They paid for it with this card. They live at this address. And again, these things aren't going away. AT&T has been keeping those records just for location going back to 2008. They're keeping your phone records, everyone you called, going back to 1987. So if you're born after 1987, they have every phone call you ever made on their network. But there were reforms, there were changes, but then they just roll over authorities. They do these in new ways. They say, all right, we're going to not do it this way that's exceptionally unconstitutional. We'll do it a little bit differently. I think it's Kissinger who said, the illegal we do immediately. The unconstitutional takes a little bit longer. So these kind of programs are continuing, and they will continue. And this is the thing: even if it's not illegal, even if it's not unconstitutional, that doesn't make it okay. Destroying the right to privacy is a fundamental violation, not just of constitutional rights, but of human rights. The construction of these systems themselves is the abuse. And so I think what we need to remember is that sometimes the scandal is not how they're breaking the law. The scandal is that they don't need to.
Yeah. All right. So, last question, Edward. So just for a layman to understand, could the government find out all the things that people are looking online at? So I know it's a funny question, but it's the thing that probably most people are concerned about, and I want people to be able to know, in your estimation, what the answer is.
Yeah. So I just read an article that was a nice little summary of some of the things that we learned in 2013 from one of the country's most prominent professors of cryptography at Johns Hopkins University. His name is Matthew Green. And it was a nice little trip down memory lane for me because the most essential thing, if you remember anything about 2013, what it was about, and one of the key stories in Permanent Record, which is, yes, a memoir of my life, but more broadly, this change in technology, in surveillance, and unfortunately, the character and values of the U.S. intelligence community in the wake of 9/11, is they shifted from what historically had been targeted surveillance, right? They go, we believe this phone line or this satellite truck or this building is associated with, the third Russian rocket division, or the second People's Liberation Army in, China, or a Ministry of State Security unit, or it's Osama bin Laden's, right? They had a specific person in mind when they were going after this, and there was a specific operation to go after a specific flow of communications. The advance of technology and the rise of the sort of corporate and competitive internet of the modern day, rather than the cooperative and creative internet of the 1990s and previous era, meant that now, instead of watching certain people, because that's all they could do because it was expensive and difficult, now they could try to watch everyone, everywhere, all the time. This is mass surveillance. The government euphemizes it as bulk collection. If you ever hear the words bulk collection, it just means mass surveillance. And what this means is, and this is covered in great detail in the book if people are interested in it, the government doesn't have to spy on you to intercept your communications because they're getting everyone's communications. When you have a phone and it's screaming out in the air, right? It's constantly all those nice things that you like. Think about how it is that they get to your phone. Think about how it is when someone dials your phone number, only your phone rings, no other phones in the world rings. How does that work, right? The phone network has to know where every phone is at all times, and which ones have which numbers in order to make them ring. When you request something, from Facebook, from YouTube, this traffic stream, this video that you're watching right now has to go out to a server. Your phone says, can anyone get me this? And a lot of middlemen have to go say, does anyone have this thing that someone's requesting? And then eventually it gets to the server. The server says, I have this file, and then it gets passed all the way back over the internet. All of those middlemen, any one of them, can make a note of that. And they can either hold on to that as long as they want, or they can go, oh, it's not important, I'm going to toss it away. It used to be that these records aged off. The things that we did online were forgotten because there was seen to be no value in them, and they took up space. They were clutter. Now, whether it's Google, whether it's Facebook, whether it's the NSA, right, whether it's North Korea, whether it's China, Russia, Iran, whoever you don't like, they can hold on to this data for basically as long as they want. And increasingly, as technology makes storage more and more capable, the length of time for which these records are held approaches something close to forever. Again, remember, AT&T is holding phone records for all of their customers going back to 1987. This kind of data, not what you said in the call, but the fact that you made the call, when the call happened, who you called, where you called them from. This is called metadata, which means data about data, but you can think of it more clearly as activity records. Not the content of the call, the fact that it happened, not the article that you retrieved from a website, but the fact that you connected to that website from this place using that phone at this time. And if you know what kind of websites people are connecting to, if you know someone, for example, watches the Young Turks, you can infer a lot about their politics. But this metadata is incredibly tiny. It's very easy to store. It's very easy to process by machines. And this is what's so toxic about this change towards mass surveillance from targeted surveillance. The content of communications, which under US law has more legal protections, is less interesting today to intelligence services than the metadata and your activity records, right? Because when you're talking to someone on the phone, you can be discreet. You can talk around something. You can use a code word. You can lie. And everyone lies, even to people that they love, when you're sitting in the surveillance chair, right, listening to the world's communications. When you send an email, when you write something, when you tell someone something, you are intentionally sharing this information. You're thinking about it. You're aware that this data does exist somewhere. You're aware someone else is going to hear this. So you think about these things. But metadata, these activity records, are often created without your awareness, without your consent, without your participation. It just happens invisibly because our devices are creating them all the time. Your phone, as soon as you finish watching this screen, you put you click the power button, phone doesn't turn off, but the screen powers down, you put it in your pocket and you go on about your day. That phone, while it's silent and just sitting there riding along with you, is still active, talking to companies, talking to governments tens, hundreds, thousands of times a minute, depending on how many apps you have installed. You have no idea what it's saying, but it's constantly creating records that are invisible to you. This is the new pollution. And just like with the last century, we had a pollution problem that we did not come to terms with for a very long time because we could not see the consequences. Silicon Valley and these institutional power structures today are intentionally creating a system that conceals the consequences of the systems and devices that we are interacting with for as long as possible, right? Through this kind of frictionless design where you just click an I agree button and it's presumed that everyone understands what they're getting into, but you didn't read it, I didn't read it, none of us read it. And it doesn't matter even if you did, because the first part of the terms of service say these companies can change those terms at any time, even without notifying you. But they are entitling themselves to the permanent record of everything you've ever done, and it no longer belongs to you. That is a very dangerous thing.
All right, and the book is called Permanent Record. Edward Snowden, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on the Young Turks. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Cenk. Stay free.